You're standing in the break room at 7:40 in the morning, microwaving the same oatmeal you've eaten most workdays for the past 6 years. The smell of it mixing with burnt coffee from a pot nobody's cleaned since Monday. A newer apprentice named Colby glances at your lunch bag, the same worn canvas one you've carried since your own apprenticeship, and says, not unkindly, "You've been a journeyman electrician for what, 12 years now? You could probably afford to treat yourself a little more than this." He means it as a friendly observation, the kind coworkers make without thinking much about it, glancing down at his own bag from a sandwich shop 2 blocks from the job site. You laugh and tell him the oatmeal's actually pretty good, which is true, and let the comment pass without explaining anything further. You don't tell him that your investment accounts crossed $780,000 last spring. You don't mention the duplex 2 towns over that's been quietly cash flowing for 9 years, or the fact that your current spending sits at roughly 34% of what you actually earn, a gap you built on purpose and have guarded carefully for over a decade. Here's the part almost nobody explains honestly about staying deliberately modest while your income climbs. It's not deprivation, and it's not some grim discipline you grit your teeth through. It's a specific, calculated decision that works precisely because almost everyone around you is doing the opposite, and the gap between those two approaches compounds into something far larger than most people ever let themselves imagine. Let's actually walk through why staying poor on purpose works, starting with the decision itself and the specific moment you made it. You made the decision, though you didn't call it that at the time. At 26, the week you finished your apprenticeship and became a full journeyman electrician, your pay jumping from $19 an hour to $34 almost overnight. You remember sitting in your truck in the parking lot after getting the news, doing quick math on your phone, and feeling a genuine pull to finally upgrade something. The 10-year-old pickup with the cracked windshield, the cramped apartment you'd been meaning to leave for 2 years. You'd earned it. In the most literal sense, 4 years of apprentice wages and grunt work had led directly to this exact number, and spending it felt like the obvious, deserved next step. You didn't upgrade either one. Instead, you kept your monthly expenses almost exactly where they'd been the week before the raise, and redirected the entire difference, nearly $1,300 a month, into a brokerage account you'd opened somewhat aimlessly a year earlier with $500 you'd had left over from a slow winter. You didn't have a sophisticated plan. You just had a specific, stubborn instinct that the raise wasn't actually yours to spend yet, not until you decided on purpose what to do with it. You remember opening the brokerage app that same week and setting the transfer for the same day your paycheck landed, mostly so you wouldn't have the chance to talk yourself out of it once the new number started feeling normal in your checking account. Your coworker at the time, an electrician named Desmond, who'd made journeyman the same month you had, made the opposite choice almost immediately. A newer truck, a nicer apartment, a lifestyle that visibly caught up to the new paycheck within about 6 weeks. You remember him showing off the truck in the job site parking lot, genuinely thrilled, and you were genuinely happy for him. You didn't judge him for it. You understood the pull completely. The specific ache of wanting something to point to after years of apprentice wages and unglamorous grunt work. You just made a different bet. One you couldn't have proven right at the time, that staying poor on paper while your income climbed would eventually be worth more than looking successful the whole way there. There was a specific moment about 8 months in when the decision genuinely tested itself. A coworker mentioned, almost as a joke, that you were still living like an apprentice despite the raise, a comment that stung more than you expected it to, mostly because it landed close enough to true to be uncomfortable. You remember sitting with that comment for a few days, seriously questioning whether the whole plan was worth the specific social cost of looking like you hadn't actually progressed. You kept the transfer running anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, telling yourself you'd give it a full year before deciding whether the discomfort had been worth it. Desmond got another raise. 2 years later, a specialty certification bump that pushed his hourly rate up another $6. His truck payment went up the same month. A newer model with a few more features, financed at a slightly higher monthly cost, that ate almost the entire raise before it ever touched anything else. He mentioned it at lunch, genuinely excited about the upgraded features, and you nodded along, remembering exactly that same excitement from your own life over things that had nothing to do with a truck. You watched this pattern repeat itself 3 more times over the following decade. a raise arriving, a lifestyle upgrade absorbing it almost completely. The actual gap between what Desmond earned and what he spent staying roughly the same width, no matter how much bigger the numbers on both sides got. By the third repetition, you started noticing the shape of it clearly enough to almost predict it, the way you'd predict a familiar wiring problem before even opening the panel. Currently, research on household spending consistently shows that the average worker increases their spending by nearly the full amount of any raise within about a year, a pattern researchers call lifestyle inflation. And it's not really a character flaw so much as a default that happens automatically unless someone deliberately interrupts it. Desmond isn't reckless or foolish. He's genuinely good at his job, careful with big decisions, thoughtful in most areas of his life. He was just running the pattern almost everyone runs unless they consciously decide not to. You ran a rough comparison once, mostly out of curiosity, between your own trajectory and a hypothetical version of yourself who'd absorbed every raise into lifestyle the way Desmond had. That hypothetical version would be saving roughly the same dollar amount today as you were at 26, essentially frozen in place despite 6 raises and 2 certification bumps totaling nearly $19 an hour in additional pay over 12 years. The actual you, redirecting a majority of each increase, is now saving close to 4 times what you started with, a gap that widens every single year a new raise arrives and gets handled the same quiet way as all the ones before it. Desmond mentioned once, at a slower point on a job site, that he sometimes wonders where all his raises actually went, genuinely puzzled by the fact that a considerably larger hourly rate hadn't translated into a considerably larger sense of financial ease. You didn't have a satisfying answer for him in the moment, mostly because explaining lifestyle inflation to someone mid-conversation on a job site felt like the wrong setting for it. You just nodded and let the comment sit, recognizing it as the exact question you'd been quietly answering for yourself, differently, for over a decade. Here's the part that makes staying deliberately modest so disproportionately powerful. It's not just that you're saving more money, it's that your savings rate, as a percentage, grows exponentially rather than gradually, because your expenses stay roughly flat while your income keeps climbing. At 26, saving $1,300 a month against a $34 an hour income put your savings rate around 26%. By 38, with your hourly rate closer to $52 and your expenses barely different from a decade earlier, adjusted only modestly for genuine inflation, that same rough dollar gap had grown into a savings rate above 55%. You ran the actual retirement math on that difference once out of curiosity, comparing a 26% savings rate held flat for an entire career against a savings rate that climbs the way yours actually did. The flat 26% scenario reaches financial independence, using a standard 25 times annual spending target in a little over 28 years. The climbing scenario, identical starting point, reaches the same target in just under 18 years, a full decade earlier, entirely because the gap between income and spending widened instead of staying constant. You remember doing this specific calculation on a rainy Sunday afternoon, running the numbers 3 separate times because the 10-year difference felt too large to trust on the first try. This is the specific mechanism that almost nobody explains clearly when they talk about frugality in the abstract. It's not really about the sacrifice of any single purchase you didn't make. It's about the compounding effect of a gap that keeps growing every time your income does, rather than a gap that stays the same width forever, funding a nicer version of an identical lifestyle instead of actually accelerating anything. You've thought about this specific distinction in terms of your own annual raises, tracked year by year in the same spreadsheet you've kept since 26. The first raise redirected added $1,300 a month to your savings. The 6th raise, arriving at a considerably higher base salary, added closer to $2,900 a month, simply because the same disciplined habit was now operating on a larger number. Desmond's raises, by contrast, each added roughly the same amount to his monthly spending that they added to his paycheck, meaning his 6th raise changed almost nothing about his actual financial position relative to his first. 1. Despite the underlying paycheck having grown substantially larger in the meantime. Currently, financial independence researchers consistently identify savings rate, more than income level itself, as the single strongest predictor of how many working years someone actually needs. A worker earning $60,000 who saves 50% will typically reach financial independence faster than a worker earning $150,000 who saves 15%, purely because of how the math of the gap compounds over time. Your mother called you 6 years ago, and you could tell within the first few words this wasn't a normal call. She'd heard, through your sister, that you were still driving that old truck and still living in that same little apartment, despite what she'd assumed by then must be a genuinely solid electrician's salary, and she wanted to know, gently but directly, if you were struggling financially in some way you hadn't told her about. Her voice had a specific, careful quality to it, the way people sound when they've rehearsed a difficult question more than once before actually asking it. You sat with the phone against your ear, feeling the specific discomfort of realizing your privacy had accidentally worried someone who loved you. You could have explained everything right there: the account balance, the duplex, the actual mechanics of the whole plan. Instead, you found yourself hedging, telling her you were doing fine without offering specifics, mostly because the full explanation felt like it would take longer than the phone call had room for, and partly because some instinct told you the explanation would change something about how she saw you that you weren't ready to test yet. You remember hanging up feeling worse than before the call started, not because anything had actually gone wrong, but because you'd left her with the same worry she'd called with in the first place. You told her the truth, 2 years later, at a family dinner, mostly because the duplex needed mentioning when your sister asked a related question about renting versus buying. Your mother's reaction wasn't what you expected. Not relief exactly, more a kind of quiet recalibration, the same look people get when a piece of information rearranges something they'd been carrying around incorrectly for years. She asked why you hadn't just told her sooner. You didn't have a perfectly clean answer. The honest version was that visibility, even with someone who loved you, changes the shape of a relationship the moment it becomes real, and you'd been protecting something you couldn't fully articulate at the time. Currently, people who study financial secrecy within families consistently find that this specific tension, protecting privacy versus managing a loved one's genuine, well-meaning worry, is one of the most common and least discussed costs of staying deliberately modest while quietly building wealth. It's not a cost that shows up on any spreadsheet. It's real anyway. Your relationship with your mother has been slightly different since that dinner. Not worse, just different, in a way that's hard to fully describe. She still comments on the truck occasionally, more affectionately now, almost like an inside joke between the two of you, rather than a genuine worry. She's also started asking, once or twice a year, small practical questions about her own modest retirement savings, questions she never would have brought to you before, now that she knows you actually know something useful about the subject. You've helped her, gently, the same unglamorous way you've helped your sister. And it's become one of the more unexpectedly rewarding parts of the whole decade plus of staying quiet in the first place. Your sister called you 11 months ago, and this time it was her turn to need something real. Her small catering business, 4 years into a genuinely good local reputation, was 3 months behind on commercial kitchen rent after a slow stretch, and the landlord was threatening to end the lease within a month, unless she caught up. She had a rough sense that you'd done well over the years, though not the specifics, and was hoping for advice, maybe a modest loan, to bridge the gap. You could have solved it before she finished the sentence. $18,000 against your current position wasn't a real financial decision. It barely registered. You didn't send it immediately. You asked if you could come by the following Saturday and go through her books together, which surprised her, since you'd never shown much interest in the catering business's finances before, always assuming, reasonably, that the numbers side of her business was hers alone to manage. That Saturday turned into 3 spread across a few weeks. You found a supplier contract she'd never renegotiated in 4 years, quietly overcharging her by nearly 20% compared to a competitor 2 towns over, and helped her find a small business relief program specific to food service that neither of you knew existed a month earlier. The second Saturday was the hardest one, going through her invoices line by line and finding a recurring delivery fee she'd been paying without realizing. A competing supplier included it for free, a detail nobody had ever sat down and pointed out to her directly before. By the third Saturday, she'd renegotiated her supplier contract secured a modest bridge loan through the relief program, and worked out a payment plan with her landlord that didn't require the emergency infusion of cash she'd originally called about. She never needed the $18,000. She called you the night the new terms were finalized. Genuinely emotional, the way people get when something they built with their own hands actually survives. That's what the 12 years of staying deliberately modest actually bought. Not the ability to write a check, which would have solved this particular Tuesday and left the underlying problem untouched, but the actual freedom to sit with her for 3 Saturdays and help her fix the thing that mattered. Her catering business has added a second part-time hire since, steady enough now that she's finally taking real weekends off most months instead of working through every single one. She still doesn't know the full scope of what you could have simply transferred that first Sunday night. What she knows is that you showed up 3 Saturdays in a row with a legal pad and genuine attention, which turned out to matter considerably more than a check ever could have. None of this means staying permanently, indefinitely modest, no matter what. Somewhere around year 10, you did upgrade the truck. Not because you'd earned some symbolic reward, but because the honest math had shifted. Repair costs climbing high enough that a newer, more reliable vehicle actually made financial sense for a job that depends on showing up on time with functioning equipment. You paid cash, bought used, and felt none of the internal conflict you might have expected, because the decision was made on its own merits rather than as a reaction to a raise or a comment from someone at the break room. You've applied the same test to a handful of other decisions over the years, a slightly nicer set of tools that genuinely reduced strain on a job you'd be doing for decades. A modest apartment upgrade after your original one developed a persistent mold problem that no amount of frugality could reasonably justify tolerating. In each case, the question was never, "Can I afford this?" You almost always could. The question was whether the purchase was solving a genuine problem or just absorbing a raise, because absorbing raises is the default everyone around you seems to be running. The actual skill isn't staying poor forever. It's staying deliberate about every single upgrade, asking whether a given purchase is genuinely improving your life or simply keeping pace with a paycheck that grew for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual needs changing. Desmond, for what it's worth, is a good electrician and a genuinely happy person, and this was never a story about him doing anything wrong. He simply never paused to ask the question you kept asking yourself at every single raise, every single certification bump, for over a decade running. Currently, financial psychologists who study long-term wealth builders note that the healthiest version of this approach isn't rigid deprivation. It's intentionality, spending genuinely and often generously on the specific things that matter, while declining, on purpose, to let spending expand automatically just because income did. You still buy good tools. You still take your partner out for a real dinner most Fridays. The oatmeal isn't a symbol of suffering. It's just genuinely what you want most mornings. The same way the worn canvas lunch bag stopped being a sign of struggling and became, somewhere along the way, just the bag you actually like using. You're back in the same break room a few weeks later, the same oatmeal, the same microwave, with the door that doesn't quite latch right. Colby's moved on to a different observation this time, asking if you're planning to bid on a bigger project coming up next quarter. You tell him you're thinking about it, and mean it, the conversation moving on without either of you circling back to the oatmeal comment from before. 12 years ago, you sat in your truck doing quick math on your phone, feeling the pull to finally upgrade something after years of apprentice wages. You didn't. Standing here now, with a net worth past $780,000 and an oatmeal habit that's outlasted 3 of Desmond's truck upgrades, you understand something you couldn't have fully explained back then. Staying poor on purpose was never about the oatmeal, or the old truck, or what any of it looked like to a coworker in a break room. It was about the gap, the deliberate, widening distance between what you earned and what you spent, and the freedom that gap quietly makes available, whether or not a single person around you ever notices it's there. You think about your sister's catering business, steadier now than it's been in years, and your mother, who still occasionally mentions the truck at family dinners but no longer worries about what it might mean. You think about Desmond, on his 4th truck now, genuinely happy, running a completely different equation than you've run for over a decade. Neither of you wrong exactly, just pointed at different things the whole time. Colby will probably make a similar comment again in a few months, The same well-meaning observation delivered fresh, and you'll probably laugh it off the same easy way you always do. What would it look like to run your own version of this gap starting today? Not staying poor forever, but staying deliberate, on purpose, about every single raise from here forward.